Hello, and welcome to South Asia Chat, a podcast series brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. My name is Dr. Imran Ahmed. I'm a research fellow here at ISAS, and I'll be your host for today's episode on the 2 years of Taliban rule in Afghanistan. Today we'll be reflecting in hindsight on the developments which led to the US withdrawal, the fall of the Afghan government, and thinking about the social, political, and economic challenges that the Afghan people continue to face under Taliban rule over the past 2 years. Our returning guest today is Dr. Haroun Rahimi, Associate Professor of Law at the American University of Afghanistan. Haroun, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So my first question sort of traces back. What led to the US negotiating with the Taliban and its ultimate decision to end its occupation of the country? Where does Afghanistan now feature in US security priorities?
So it is now well known that right after the US toppled the Taliban regime, there might have been a chance for Taliban to surrender to the internationally supported government that was then being established in Afghanistan in 2001. But at the time, the U.S. was in no mood to negotiate. Rumsfeld apparently stated in the records that are now made public that the U.S. does not want to negotiate, even surrender, not like in terms of a compromise. Just a mere surrender was not something that the U.S. was interested in. Even though then Karzai, who was the head of the administration that was taking shape in place of the Taliban, was keen to pursue that surrender route with the Taliban. But obviously, without the U.S. approval and support, it could not have been feasible. So that was dropped. And the Afghanistan at the time experienced, right after the U.S. intervention, experienced a moment of triumphant. And that's the time actually my family returned to Afghanistan from Iran, where they were refugees. So I remember personally how vibrant the country was. There were things being built everywhere. There was a lot of hope. The elections that took place, the early elections, had like record turnouts by like standards anywhere in the world. People were so excited, and a lot of things were happening. And the country experienced a moment of tranquility and more or less peace. There were some people who hold certain areas of the country under their control, and they sometimes challenged and had face-off with the central government. But there were very like low-level tensions overall. Overall, the picture was very positive. But after a while, that changed. Taliban were able to regroup, capitalize on the weakness of the new regime, the fact that the U.S. American attention moved away from Afghanistan to Iraq, the fact that the many promises of the new political system did not materialize, so there was a lot of deep level of disappointment on the side of the population. So all those things, and also the fact that the U.S. Made a point of trying to punish those who the U.S. was perceived to be affiliated with Al-Qaeda, even though many of these, the intelligence based on which these people were arrested, harassed, and then sometimes tortured and transferred to black sites across the world, and ultimately many ended up in Guantanamo, were very flimsy. So there was a kind of a mass campaign of harassments and arrests and torture that pushed a lot of some Talibans who might have felt like they had really no chance of returning, push them to the point where they felt like there's no chance, they had no option but to try to organize some sort of resistance. And the Taliban insurgency was born and grew over time. It took few years until they became a formidable force. It was during Obama era, towards the second term of Obama era. The first term, when Obama came to office, he was interested in trying to win Afghanistan, quote unquote, because the idea was Iraq was the bad war, Afghanistan was the good war, and the U.S. felt like it needed to win in Afghanistan as a way to cover what was perceived as a failing war in Iraq. And there was a lot of lessons that were kind of transferred from Iraq campaign militarily to Afghanistan. So there was a lot of push for some sort of winning the war, quote unquote, the war against insurgency. But soon I think Obama realized that it may not be feasible, and the decision was made to negotiate to reach some sort of political settlement with the Taliban. At the time, the main issue was that the U.S. wanted the Taliban to negotiate with the Afghan government, and Taliban were unwilling to do that. They wanted to negotiate directly with the United States. The negotiation did not go far because the military elements insisted that they needed more time to have the upper hand, that they should be negotiating a position of strength. But the facts on the ground actually worked against them. As time moved on, the military position of the international coalition and the Afghan government security forces that were backed by international coalition actually weakened. So the Taliban position is strengthened, and the position of the United States and the Afghan government weakened, to the point that eventually the subsequent U.S. administrations decided to pursue the political settlement a little bit more seriously and more aggressively, and kind of give up the idea of having preconditions. But they held on. I think the Americans held on to the idea that the Afghan government should be part of the negotiation. But I think until the very end, where the Trump administration decided that they were willing to drop that condition and negotiate directly with the Taliban without involvement of the Afghan government, which now in hindsight many see that as a major flaw in the whole design that might have caused a cascade of effects that culminated in the collapse of the Afghan government. So that's kind of how it came to be, and the negotiation took place in Doha between the United States, represented by the special envoy Zalmay Khalilzad, and a political mission of the Taliban that were based at the time in Doha. It was a very long process, took a couple of years, but at the end, a deal was reached, as you referred to, in Doha. And the deal was fundamentally, came down to what interested the United States and Taliban the most, which was the withdrawal of American troops. It did not consider other factors, like the political future of the country, very seriously. Issues of rights were really not part of the agreement, even though many have said that Taliban made assurances, but it is not a core part of the actual agreement. The agreement talks about the intra-Afghan dialogue that should follow, but leaves all those things in kind of an uncertain manner and defer all of those things to a future negotiation with the Taliban, between Afghanistan government and the Taliban, Afghan government at the time, and the Taliban. But once that deal was reached between the U.S. and Taliban, and a deadline for withdrawal was set, and though that part of the agreement was kind of solidified, the intra-Afghan dialogue, which was called, never materialized. So the fight actually intensified. Taliban promised not to attack the Americans, and the Americans promised not to attack the Taliban in a kind of offensive manner. But Taliban made no assurance not to target the Afghan security forces. So they made point of that. They made use of that, and they kind of ramped up their attacks across the country. They capitalized on this idea that the U.S. had made a deal with us, and that the U.S. Government will no longer support the Afghan government, and it is the fate of the republic is decided. And it's they made a good job campaigning on this, and basically telling people you should not unnecessarily die and just accept the inevitable, that is that we are going to return to power, make a deal with us, and we give you assurances of safety in exchange. And that changed the battlefield even in a more rapid way. Also, the promise of the U.S. not to attack the Taliban and then commitment to a schedule of withdrawal made a lot of things worse for the Afghan security forces, because they were very much dependent on intelligence, logistics, and support, especially air support from the American forces. When the American forces, their hands were tied by the deal, the Afghan government and their forces were kind of on their own. So the Taliban kind of ramped up attacks, and the Afghan government forces lost a lot of support in a very short period of time once the deal was reached. And that kind of all cascaded a series of effects that led to the collapse of Afghanistan security forces and the Afghan Republic in entirety. If now you go to touch on your last question of where is the U.S. where is Afghanistan in the U.S. kind of national security priorities, President Biden makes the point that the decision that was made to stick to Doha deal, which was negotiated by the Trump administration, but President Biden decided to stick with the deal. He pushed the deadline, but generally stuck with the deal. The decision reflected the fact that Afghanistan was no longer a major national security priority for the United States. He made the point that the threat picture has changed, that Al-Qaeda has been diminished to the point of more or less irrelevant, that the competition with China required a lot more attention, and being tied down resource-wise, attention-wise in Afghanistan was losing a strategy. So fundamentally, he basically said Afghanistan is no longer that important to the security of the national security of the United States, and that's why we should get out of Afghanistan as soon as possible. And that's maintained the case until the Biden. Even though there are reports that some security threats from Afghanistan may be emerging and they may reach the point where they become a problem for the U.S., but it's not there yet.
Thank you so much. My next question, and I think you've touched on this a little bit already about your mentioning about how the Taliban regrouped. I wanted to ask, while the US occupation was taking place, what do you think contributed to the military resilience of the Taliban for it to survive in those 20 odd years? And you've talked about a little bit on the fight between the Taliban forces and the Afghan National Security Forces. What do you think ultimately led to the Afghan National Security Forces basically swift collapse? And are there any pockets of resistance today?
So with regard to your first question, obviously it's a complex, it has to be, there are a series of factors that were involved. One major factor was the fact that the Pakistani government early on made the decision that they wanted a regime in Kabul that was friendly to them. And they made the calculation that the regime that was installed by the United States was not that it was much more friendlier to India, and that was seen as a major strategic threat to Pakistan. So Pakistan decided that they should provide support to the Taliban insurgency, in the hopes that eventually either Taliban will negotiate their way to power and become a major constituency of power, and that way they would provide a friendly force in Kabul, a friendly political force, or they would outright win. They may not have predicted this kind of a swift win, but they may at some point win, and that would be maybe even more preferable, given they would have much more control in Kabul.
Can I ask what kind of support did the Pakistan government provide?
So it is a very so I like how one analyst put it, and he said there's a risk in understating and overstating the Pakistan's influence here. They were very influential. If nothing else, the fact that the Taliban could retreat to Pakistan to regroup. For example, if they had fighters who were injured or they were under a lot of pressure, they could withdrew to Pakistan and out of reach of Afghan and international forces. They could recruit from the networks of madrasas in the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan for fighters. It was commonly known that there is a fighting season, and the students of these madrasas would take some time off, would be encouraged to take some time off from their studies to join the Afghan jihad, as it was called. So they kind of manpower and the fact that they could receive safe havens and medical treatments. And also they raised a lot of money. There were a lot of sympathy for Taliban in that area through religious networks that existed. And on top of that, the ISI, I think is very well established, that provided technical support, trainings, in terms of providing like money and weaponry. I think early on they might have needed a lot more external support, but over time Taliban controlled territory and they controlled the smuggling routes and opium route. They became a lot more self-sufficient, I think, over time. But in earlier stages, I think they needed some hand-holding. And I think the Pakistani security forces, ISI, the intelligence, helped them with that regard. But to say that that was the sole reason or even the critical condition for the Taliban success, I think may be an exaggeration. It may have been sufficient. It may have been necessary, but it was never a sufficient condition for their success. What resulted in their success was multiple factors. One was that the population became dissatisfied with the way things were going in the country, especially population in the south and the rural areas where the actual war on terror was being fought. Where the development benefits were very little. So these people were bearing the cost of the international war in Afghanistan, but were not getting any benefits of it. The benefit was going more to people who were living in major urban centers and some part of the countries where the insurgency was not as active. They just for the fact that they were much more amenable to the kind of intervention that was going on in Afghanistan, they received more benefits. It took advantage of the opportunity that was presented. But the war that was being fought in the south, in the pursuit of sometimes imagined Al Qaeda figures who had imagined links to some people in the south and some people who were supposed to be high-ranking Taliban, did not lead the people in a rural Afghanistan, especially in the south and many other parts of the country, to actually receive any major benefits. So they did not receive dividends from the international intervention. So they were very dissatisfied with that. And as you know, the war creates its own fuel, in a sense that when you kill somebody, they have a reasons to fight you. They have personal reasons to fight you. And the continuation of those campaigns, I think, contributed. There was also the fact that the government in Kabul was perceived as being illegitimate. It was perceived to be dependent extremely on outside forces. It was perceived to be sometimes picking sides, basically trying to cater to its international supporters and donors. At times when the decisions were made that were in conflict with the sentiments on the ground.
When you say on the ground, do you mean sort of the people?
Absolutely right. For example, there were many pieces of legislations that were very controversial. Afghanistan is a very conservative society. There was a desire to implement progressive policies in Afghanistan, to turn Afghanistan as the success story of democracy, rule of law, and human rights. And one way to do that, the easy way to do it, was just to pass legislations that were very progressive. Even though the implementation would be probably lacking and they would not really be well received, but it would be an achievement for those who were investing in Afghanistan to see those legislations get passed and to see some institution, at least formal institution, being built around those legislations, around those progressive policies that were supposed to advance women's rights, equality. But part of the population might have felt that those policies do not reflect their concerns adequately. There were concerns about the conflict between some of these policies with Islam, the way it was practiced in especially rural traditional parts of the country. And instead of trying to work through achieving buy-in for these policies, I think many times the sentiment was that the preference of people is disregarded in favor of international supporters of the regime, which was, I think, not untrue, given the fact that the government was much more reliant on the support from the international community than the local population. The funding was coming from the international community. Many people who held political power in Kabul did really have backing foreign forces, political forces in the country. And elections were supposed to be the critical test of really getting people to back your claim to power, were very much contested. So I think no one was able to receive a real clear mandate from the population that could have corrected some of those legitimacy deficiencies. So you had at least perceived to be illegitimate and dependent, at least by some, imposed by some. You had an insurgency that had external support, and you had an Afghan government that was very, very corrupt and ineffective, and it has had its own fragmentations inside, because it was basically a loose coalition of people who were fighting the Taliban before the US intervened. And then when the US intervened, they kind of suddenly won the war, quote unquote, because the US was able to push Taliban out of the picture. And some technocrats who were coming from abroad, many people who hold dual passports. There was a mix of these people who were running the country, and at a time where billions of dollars were injected into the country. So they did a lot of mismanagement, a lot of corruption and waste was going on. And all of that kind of diminished the legitimacy, but also basically created vacuums where the Taliban could pose themselves as a better government, to be honest. Especially in the areas of delivery of justice, many people would tell you that their court system was more effective. Many people would say in areas where it was not contested and Taliban were effectively in power, they sometimes could actually provide security better, deal with petty crimes better, the kind of things that people consider to be important kind of functions of a government. Sometimes many people had a sentiment that maybe Taliban are better at it. And it was not that Taliban were very good, it was just the alternative was very bad. The government was failing at a higher rate.
Thank you so much for that. It was very interesting to hear about all the different factors that at the same time held the Taliban together while undermined the the Afghan government. Um, One of the questions that arose after the fall of Kabul um, was, you know, about diplomatic recognition and about how will the international community um, engage with the Taliban regime. So I wanted to ask, um, how has that taken shape over the past 2 years? Have any states come to recognize the regime?
The short answer is no. The formal legal recognition is yet to come from any country, even those who were seem very sympathetic towards Taliban return to power, for example, Pakistan and Iran. But if you look at de facto engagement, that has been very much robust. Many countries have had frequent and sustained contact with the Taliban, while acknowledging that those contacts do not constitute formal legal recognition. Many of Afghanistan's embassies and consulates in the region have been handed over to Taliban appointees. Uh, Even though outside the region in Europe and the US, all the embassies and consulates are either closed or are held by their public era appointees. Within the region, the pragmatism and the need to coordinate things have prevailed, and Taliban appointees were allowed to take office. Um, so there have been a de facto engagement. I think there was recently a tally of number of meetings that was taken has taken place between the Taliban and officials of different governments. Interestingly enough, I think the most frequent contact had been with Turkish officials. After that, China, I think, in terms of just number, not the substantive contact, just the number of contacts and meetings that were publicized. And after that, Pakistan and Iran and these countries were very much on top of the list that had official meetings with the Taliban officials. So it is happening across the board. Outside the region, there's a lot more hesitancy for obvious reasons. There's a strong civil society, a domestic constituency in Europe and the US that is much more concerned about the human rights situation in the country, and they have a lot more sway over the government and can create a lot more political pressure against what they perceive to be normalization and mainstreaming of the Taliban as a regime that is credibly accused of implementing gender apartheid in Afghanistan. Even with that, the European Union has returned to Afghanistan. They've reopened their mission in Kabul. U.S. Was, I think, considering it, but they have not made the decision to actually open political office in Kabul. There are calls coming from many countries, Canada, UK, talking about the need to reopen diplomatic offices in Kabul. They do make trips, except for the US, I think. All other countries have made trips, like their diplomats have made trips to Kabul and met with Taliban in Kabul. The US, as a matter of policy, has made the point to meet with the Taliban official only in Doha, Qatar, and they have made a policy not to go and meet with Taliban in Kabul. But there has been a sustained, robust level of engagement and contact. It has its own critics and supporters, this approach, and we can debate how fruitful have they been, but that's a counterfactual compared to the alternative of no recognition that we don't really, no engagement that we don't really have evidence for because it's counterfactual. Many have described this as like soft recognition or like de facto recognition, but the bottom line is that many perceive outside in the region and beyond perceive that Taliban don't have an alternative, that they are for at least time being the only authority in Afghanistan. And if they have interest in Afghanistan, be it human rights, be it humanitarian issues, be it security threats from Afghanistan, they have to find a way to work with the Taliban. It may be frustrating, it may be very difficult, but that seems to be the conclusion that is the only option available, at least for time being.
And moving towards the situation within Afghanistan. Now, Afghanistan is facing a humanitarian crisis, perhaps of unprecedented proportions, something we read in the news quite often. Recently, the World Food Programme in Afghanistan declared a serious funding shortfall to address the food insecurity and malnutrition in the country. What do you see as the most pressing or persistent challenges in delivering aid effectively into Afghanistan? I think you've touched a little bit about how the international engagement now takes place. I'm also curious on the role of what NGOs play in this crisis.
I think there are some couple of things to consider. One is that the problems for the Afghanistan is structural. So the poverty was rampant even before this happened. The economy was very much dependent on the war. It was more or less a war economy. Experts have considered Afghanistan a rentier state, where the rent was not natural resources. The rent was just the foreign aid that was coming to the country just by the virtue of the fact that the international forces were fighting a war in the country and they needed to support that. And when you consider that, the structural problems, after the Taliban returned to power, the amount of aid kind of reduced to a great degree. The amount of money that was going to the country was reduced to a great degree, mostly in the military aid because there was no longer a war. The civilian aid, the amount that goes to the country now, at least the figures we can see, and what was going on in terms of civilian aid to Afghanistan before the Taliban are not the same, but they are comparable. But the difference is that it used to be under budget aid. Under budget assistance to Afghanistan. It used to be development. So the kind of aid that you would get, the kind of assistance you would get more for your buck. You, in terms of the overhead cost, as you know, government is a lot cheaper than the international NGO system and the UN. Also, development, it's obvious, I think, to anyone with any sense of economics that you invest in development and livelihood projects, you get a lot more return than just feeding people by giving them food to eat. So that the military aid stopped, so that was like major impact to the economy because the war economy kind of collapsed. On the other side, the civilian assistance, the nature and the method of delivery changed, and that made aid a lot less effective, assistance a lot less effective, because overhead costs are incredibly high. The kind of aid that goes to the country for political reasons cannot be development aid. It has to be humanitarian assistance. They tried to expand the definition of humanitarian assistance, call it humanitarian plus, trying to support what they call the basic human needs. But what it means fundamentally is that long-term projects that could address structural problems of the Afghan economy, basically poverty alleviation, cannot really happen in this political climate. For many reasons. The primary reason is that to do those projects, you need to cooperate very closely with the governments, like the World Bank and other major actors often work through and with governments to implement these projects. If you have a government that is not internationally recognized, that any meeting even with them comes with a reputational cost, it makes it much more difficult. And obviously, most of the money comes from the US and then Europe and Japan, not the region where there may be a lot more political will towards the current regime. It comes from places where domestic constituencies on human rights are much more stronger, and there's a lot more a strong critique of working with the Taliban. That kind of puts constraints on what the US or Europe can actually do in terms of going beyond the basic humanitarian assistance. But the fact is that humanitarian assistance remains, because of the fact that we are not able to move towards addressing those structural issues, humanitarian assistance has been vital. It is absolutely necessary. But as you pointed out, the donor fatigue, the fact that donors feel like the Afghanistan problem is not improving, or they feel like Taliban are actually going down the path of making it much more difficult for them to justify to their domestic constituency their aid to Afghanistan, is actually making it difficult politically, or make it less attractive politically to sustain the much needed vital assistance to the country. Obviously, you have many conflicts breaking out, many crises breaking out in the world as well. You have the Ukraine situation, you have Sudan situation. So it is very hard to keep sustained attention to Afghanistan and justify to a domestic constituency based in the US and Europe that we should send money to a country where the rulers are basically systematically removing all women from their public life. They're systematically persecuting minorities. They're systematically committing crimes that the UN considers crimes against humanity. But we still need to send money to feed the population. Even though there may be a humanitarian imperative to do so, maybe it is the right thing to do so, and I do believe it's the right thing to do so, but it's much more difficult to politically get backing for it. So it's easy to shift away from Afghanistan and try to kind of wait and see what would happen. But in the meantime, the population are put in a position where they really have no other option for survival, because the world is not really disengaging completely. The sanctions are still there. Restrictions are still there. So not doing something with Afghanistan, which may be preferable options for Biden administration and others, is really not on the table. On the table is to neglect Afghanistan and let the people suffer, or find a way to make sure that the people of Afghanistan have a way to earn a living and support them in the process until they get to a point where the economy adjusts to a level where people can actually survive. It is going to be a long-term commitment. We're talking 10, 20 years, and it requires a lot of things to align, including Taliban's actions, which sadly we haven't seen a progress on any of those fronts yet.
Thank you so much. Now, my final question is in regards to things that you've touched on just now about the situation about rights and the interest in human rights and women's rights. Now, we read a great deal about the Taliban's disregard for women as well as human rights. And at the same time, it's often spun in a way about the supremacy of the Sharia. 2 years on, what can you tell us about the legal system, laws, and legal institutions that have gradually taken shape since the Taliban have come to power? And you mentioned earlier about how local populations sometimes looked at Taliban-administered law and institutions as more effective. I was wondering if you can tell us what you know about the current situation.
So Taliban haven't adopted a constitution yet, so they haven't come out with an overall design of what their legal system should look like. The Chief Justice, the acting Chief Justice, has produced a book that is literally called The Islamic Emirate and Its Order. And that is the closest we get to a legal manifesto for the regime they want to create in Afghanistan. And the book actually has the endorsement of Hibbatullah, Mullah Hibbatullah, who's the supreme leader. So he has written an endorsement. The book is obviously an academic work still, so it's not a formal legal document, but it actually gives a window into what the Taliban believe the system should be. And if you read that, in terms of political power, all the political power is concentrated in the person of Amir, and the Amir is the absolute power in all areas of political life, and that is reflected in practice as well. The decisions come from Kandahar, sometimes very controversial, sometimes decisions that do not reflect the sentiments of the population, or maybe a major part of the Taliban forces, but they come from the Amir from Kandahar, and they are followed, implemented. Maybe begrudgingly, maybe imperfectly, but they are followed. So you see that there is an image of Amir shaping as the person who holds the ultimate kind of power, and he has been showing that power more. And despite some concerns that were voiced even by Taliban about the monopolization of power, or the fact that maybe we are doing certain things that are counterproductive to our ultimate goal of having an Islamic regime in the country, it seems like his visions or his ideas prevail, right? And that comes through the book as well, that there's a justification presented from pre-modern Islamic sources about the fact that the Emir has basically the ultimate power. There's also another element to the regime that is, as you pointed out, the Sharia, that other than the Emir, the other element of the Islamic state is the divine law. And it is presented as the fact that this is non-negotiable. This has kind of a constitutional character, meaning that the Taliban will not be able to compromise, negotiate, or back down from policies that they believe reflect the Sharia. But when you ask them, for example, let's take like educational policy, like the ban on girls' education. If you ask them, okay, how would you justify it? They would tell you, as many other areas where they have implemented restrictions, that certain actions that that are permissible in Islam can also be restricted, can also be banned if the political ruler believes that they could lead to something haram, something that is morally corrupt. So Taliban are basically taking the pre-modern set of restrictions and putting a layer on top, saying that we need to stop slippery slopes. We need to basically build the restrictions a lot higher than required, because they argue that the country has been ruled for 20 years by the forces that they consider to be corrupt, and we need to basically reform the society. So in a sense, you have this idea that the Sharia is what the basis of everything we do, but at the same time, it is turned into some sort of ideology, in a sense that we are trying to create a different kind of person in Afghanistan, a better kind of Muslim in Afghanistan. And to do so, we don't have to even be bound by Sharia. We can go beyond it. We can be even more restrictive. We can be more oppressive, because of the fact that what they call corruption of the time, or fasad al-zaman, the time are corrupt. This particular community was exposed to a lot of corrupt influences, and we need to root them out. And if you tell them that people are very unhappy with these policies, are incredibly unpopular, they would say, give us time. Once we transform the person of Afghanistan, once we transform the community, once we had our time to instill these new values in the population, they will come around and like them. So in a sense, their answers to unpopularity of their policies, and their answers to the fact that some of their policies are not like squarely rooted even in Sharia, is that yes, but we need to be a lot more aggressive, first of all, especially on women's rights issue, because times have changed, because we are dealing with a community that is been corrupted in their mind. And on top of it, if you ask them that these policies are incredibly unpopular and they're actually making your movement maybe unpopular, their answer is that give us time. Once we change the people, then they would actually their hesitancy and their resistance would vanish as well. So that's all to say that we're not dealing with a simple application of Islamic law either. Even if one goes to say, okay, they want to exclusively look at pre-modern sources and they want to go with orthodoxy, not even new understanding, which are much more pluralistic. Even if you go with orthodoxy, they kind of fall short, and they have to rely on these other kind of power-centric or social engineering kind of line of arguments that they have kind of flimsy relationship with the Sharia.
To fill in the gaps, kind of.
Yeah. And it becomes about power, about creating a population that is subservient to the Islamic State, and in that sense, that is the best subject of the state that they are ruling, which has very interesting parallels to how nation states are created. I mean, Foucault was writing about the fact in the Western tradition that a state creates subjectivity that are best subject for the state. That's kind of the whole way the education system, the healthcare system, the hospital, prison system, education system in Foucault's critique of Western tradition was set up. You can see kind of parallels that they're basically saying the same thing, that once we are done creating the kind of Afghan and Muslim we want in Afghanistan, then that's going to be the kind of Afghan and Muslim is going to be the best subject, the best citizen of the state that we are envisioning. So instead of the state reflecting what people want, just give us time to create the kind of citizens, the kind of population that would be okay with the state we think should exist in Afghanistan. And that is kind of the fundamental slippage in terms of their Sharia argument, because Sharia was never about that, especially in pre-modern context. It was community-based. It was not a tool for social engineering. Just think about this. The idea that in a pre-modern context, a Muslim ruler would say, in order to get health treatment, you have to have someone accompanying you would be absurd, because the state was not in the business of actually running a healthcare. To say that you cannot get an education because you are of a certain age made no sense, because there was no public education system. So Taliban are really doing what a modern state does, which is basically control everything in a certain way and create subjectivity in Foucault's terms, create kind of people that are best subject of the state. But they are doing it. They're doing it in terms of technologies of governmentality, doing it in a very, very modern way. They're using the technologies of public healthcare system, public education system, the technologies of controlling the media space, all modern technologies of governance, what Foucault would call governmentalities. They're using all of that, but instead of creating a kind of Western liberal nation-state model, they're claiming that they're creating an Islamic version of it. But the oppression comes true in the same way. And it's very different than how Sharia was operating, which was tended to be much more conflict management, much more community based, as you know. It was more ulama being dependent on the community for support and legitimacy, and then trying to guide and shape the community. And the state being a very minimal presence, other than taxation and some maybe warfare, it was very minimal presence. So I think that's fundamentally what makes Taliban version of Sharia implementation very oppressive, because it is very much instrumentalizing nation states and modern technologies of governance, which Foucault called governmentality, and then basically saying we get the substantive rules from Islam. Basically, fundamentally, they're saying that these forms are neutral, meaning in the past, it's okay that they did not have the tools and public education system, public healthcare system, or media control. This is kind of, we have them now, and we can still use the pre-modern sources and implement them with these modern technologies of governance. But you don't appreciate that these modern technologies of governments are changing the nature of Sharia. And that's what, I'm not an original thinker here. While Halak was making the point when he called the impossible state, he was basically saying that is the problem. You cannot have Sharia operate in the context of modern nation state, because Sharia operate in a very different way. And Taliban are keeping the nation state, or just trying to implement Sharia, which gets you something that is not Sharia. It's just very oppressive. And you can think about it. Islam and the way it was practiced in the past was not this oppressive. People, or you would have read in the books that people were going around saying there's a very oppressive regime that is using the books of God to just really oppress us. You don't get that sentiment because no one was really holding all the power in that way that could go on and do everything, bulldozering any form of resistance and popular sentiment in their way.
Thank you so much. I think that's all we pretty much have time for. Professor Haroun, thank you for sharing your insights and joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're listening to South Asia Chat. You can learn more about our work by visiting us at isas.nus.edu.sg. You can also get updates on our research and publications through social media. You can find us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram.